how's the banking industry adopting its lending practices to support the green transition in Malaysia? And as a banker, how do you balance the need of economic development with sustainability goals in your financing decision?
Especially that last question is most important for a developmental financial institution. Well, first almost to answer that question, the generic answer that cuts across all banks in FIs in Malaysia is of course they're getting ready. You hear a lot of the banks have announced their ESG framework. This is of course voluntary but also driven by investors that requires them to do so. From our regulator, Bank Negara, they've also had the foresight as early as even before COVID itself. They came up with guidelines for the bankers to classify climate risk, categorize them, so that there can be some form of mapping out how much climate risk that we are taking as financial institutions. So this climate change taxonomy came out and helped us to classify which one is a transition financing, a company that's in the transition, which one is polluting, which one is helping tremendously, right? And that's what all the banks have started doing. And we are getting prepared because the next thing the regulator is going to do is in the next few years ask us to stress test. What happens if you have a drought? How much of these classifications going to impact in terms of turning into bad loans, for example? So the banks are getting ahead of the curve. They're doing that. They're also doing, as you can see in the booths outside, some banks have really come up with specialized schemes for a specific type of financing related to sustainable EV financing and so forth and so forth. So they're preparing in that regard. For Bank Pembangunan, because we're a developmental financial institution, we have to balance not just from an ESG point of view, but also the developmental needs of the country. So this is no easy task. This is a balancing act because, as you rightly pointed, environmental, social, governance all comes into play. But is it at the expense of development of the country? Does that mean we don't finance any oil and gas projects now? Stop, right? I know the controversial with coal-fired power plants, right? But if the country really needs the coal, or needs the power in the coal to a certain extent, does that mean there's totally no goal? So that balancing act is important. So at Bank Pembangunan, we realized with all these conflicts, there must be a way for us to synthesize and analyze and come to a decision whether we want to finance a specific project or not. So as early as 3 years ago, Bank Pembangunan with the World Bank, cooperating with World Bank, we come up with a framework that we call Measuring Impact for National Development. It's important to come up with this framework to incorporate the UNDP Sustainable Goals, as well as the Rancangan Malaysia ke-12, RMK-12, goals and objectives into this framework. So what it is, in summary, is a series of questions, a scorecard, if you may. So we ask our clients who comes to asking for a financing, is your project doing this? A, doing this, B, creating jobs, and so forth, and so forth. And all these questions is to address the UNDP social inclusivity, sustainability, and also the government objectives in terms of economic catalysts. At the end, you get a score. If the score is above the threshold, then we finance. If it's, let me rephrase that. If it's above the threshold, we consider financing. If it's below the threshold, we don't even look at it. Even if it's profitable, even if it makes perfect sense from a return, from a financing point of view, and it's low risk, but it is not having enough impact. Why? Because Bank Pembangunan also has limited capital. As you rightly picked up, we have to spare the capital to where it does best, most impactful as much as possible. So once the score is above the threshold, then we look at the bankability and the credit evaluation. You cannot run away, and we have to do that part as well. But at least the MIND framework addresses the balancing act between environmental, social, net, it must be positive. Positive, negative items must add up in a positive score for the variables. So that's one way we are addressing the need to balance these things.
Thank you. That's a very good insights. I think now we would probably want to take a look on how to get to the scorecard that you have, right? It's a very structured way of doing it, which is good because otherwise then it will be very difficult in terms of assessing the economic impact that will come through from the financing. So thank you, Nazri. So from next, I would like to turn to Anjali. From policy advocacy standpoint, what are the key policy trends shaping sustainable finance in Asia, in your view, and are they effective in driving transformation in Asia? And how do they compare to the global standards that you have seen?
Thank you. Just so I don't end up speaking through this entire session in terms of policy trends that are important, I might restrict my remarks to perhaps the top 2 to 3 policy trends that's quite important in driving the sustainable finance flows into Asia. So I think the first one is discussed quite a bit through the day. I think data is the most important factor that really will work towards helping us diagnose what the problem is, also looking at possible solutions and also assessing the credibility of these solutions. Also, as sustainable finance is becoming more mainstream, the risk of greenwashing, as I'm sure if you've heard about it over the course of this day and generally, data transparency really helps in sort of building that accountability and transparency in terms of performance. And there are, I think the markets in Asia are doing really well in sort of moving the needle on disclosure standards and mandating it. Several markets, including Malaysia, Singapore, across Asia, they've already sort of mandated and are phasing in disclosure standards. I think Malaysia is sort of really doing a good job in creating also platforms that makes this data accessible to the public, to investors, to really help them understand the market better, that thereby also opening up the market to newer investments in sustainability. And so I think the disclosure trend is one that is quite fundamental sort of going forward for sustainable finance. One trend that's also complementary to disclosure is transition planning. We see, institutions like the Transition Planning Task Force was set up in the UK to really help create standards on how companies and financial institutions can create credible transition plans, which is sort of an instrument that will enable a company to communicate effectively to the world on sort of what their transition strategy is in response to their climate targets. It's really important for companies and investors to really sort of be clear about how their asset structures, their business strategies will change as a response to their transition plans. And sort of demonstrating that clearly through transition planning will drive more credibility into the finance that will flow into a company and into projects. So I think these two trends are quite fundamental. When you have good data and when you have a clear transition plan, things like ancillary policies like taxonomies will really spur the movement in attracting sustainable finance to sort of where it really needs to go. And then a third pillar would be on sort of national policy, right, or state level policy. I think this sort of came up in questions, during the course of the conversation today. So having a clear national transition plan or accountability in terms of the way the government looks at approaching climate change is quite crucial as well. So in the Malaysian context, the climate change bill would be quite instrumental in actually showing the market level commitment to what they've made in terms of like a global commitment on climate. It will really build market confidence and sort of attract more investments into a market that is very clear in terms of what its ultimate objectives are and how it plans to achieve it through clear short-term, medium-term and long-term planning. So I think these would be really sort of what drives sustainable finance flow.
Thank you, Anjali. Your perspective on the policy and financing is crucial to understand the broader context. Next, I would like to move to Tom. Tom, as an industry player, do you think the banks, regulators, and investment communities are doing enough to drive this green shift?
Yeah, I think I can comment specifically in terms of energy sector, in particular electricity, which I'm practicing in. So I think to answer your question, yes, I think all of them are very participative. The banks are very supportive. Since we first started doing our first lending, we first borrowing 10, 15 years ago compared to now, it's much different from 15 years ago. So the banks are much more willing to finance energy transition projects compared to last time. And now whenever you win a project, the bank will start calling you instead of you calling the bank. So there's no doubt about that kind of support the bank have. In terms of policy regulator, I think we have seen the government setting very good and significant target. We have seen many big policy framework that came out, NEPR and things, similar things that came out, and we see subsequent program being rolled out. So in that perspective, I think they are doing very well, and the capital the market is also very participative. The investors' interests are at all-time high, and it can only get higher because of all the excitement that everybody has in terms of this industry. So while everybody is very participative, I think the key questions is, are they aligning to each other? Whatever they are doing, is the policy aligned to the capital market? Is the capital market aligned to the banking sector? I think this is one crucial question. Government can introduce a very ambitious program, whether it is the best program for the banks or not, or for the investors. So while it all seems very good on the surface, but I think the devil is in the detail, which I think we can explore, dive deeper and explore. So for me, there is three fundamental elements for energy sector, especially renewable energy, the challenge. One is technical challenge, second is a policy challenge, third is capital challenge. So technical, Malaysia has seen a surge of renewable energy projects, at least on the project that are being awarded. So currently you see that Malaysia, we have very little connection capacity left in the grid. So there is a need to look at how we are going to inject further electricity into the grid. So this is one challenge that from a planning perspective, right? Second is from the policy perspective, what is the challenge? While they are very supportive, I think the policy challenge is sometimes the alignment between the policy and the requirements of the investor is a bit different. For example, I think there are some policy that restrict ownership change in Malaysia for power plant. Let's say there's a moratorium, long moratorium. So this also presents a challenge to asset owner, whereas Malaysia need 1.8 trillion of investment until 2050. So we need a lot of capital to mobilize to build plants after plant after plant. So people can't hold on to plants for very long, right? While the intention is good, but it actually restricts liquidity in the equity market. So the problem in Malaysia actually is not that, it's actually equity. As I say, the bank is very supportive, but for every $8 or $7 that the bank provide, the investor have to provide $2 to $3. So the problem is this $2 to $3 is stuck in the old asset. So how do you release this money and turn the project into maybe say pension fund, maybe EPF or somebody else, to have it with a low risk, low return, and then you free up this capital for the developer like us to reinvest into a new plant. So I think this is the alignment that I'm talking about. So there are things like this and a lot of topic of how we are going to invest in infrastructure, what is the best optimized way to make it, not affecting the general public, the price of electricity while we are investing in grid, investing in battery at the grid. So how do we most optimize, in the best optimized level, invest in this kind of infrastructure? It's both a technical question as well as it's a policy question as well. So this is my
Thank you, Tom. So just to take your point, Tom, in terms of the capital as well as the equity issue here, I want to move on to JJ. Your viewpoint from an oil and gas company, which typically operates with high level of financial leverage. What strategies do you employ to reassure banks that and investors about the viability and security of taking additional debt for your company? One. Number two is that how do you ensure continued support and financing from these stakeholders in light of the industry's evolving landscape? What strategies can we implement to de-risk this project and attract more equity investment?
So